On his wedding day, my adopted son thanked everyone except me. He said he built everything on his own, but it was my name on every deed. I smiled. I stayed seated. That night, they handed me a contract and told me to sign my legacy away. I didn't say a word. But deep down, something shifted. What happens when a mother chooses silence over revenge and wins anyway? On the day of his wedding, they sat me at the farthest table right next to the catering station. I could hear the clinking of glass trays and the hiss of chafing dishes behind the curtain. Every few minutes, a waiter would bump my chair passing through. No one seemed to notice, or maybe they did and just didn't care. The ceremony had been beautiful. Lake Tahoe was glowing with soft gold, the kind that makes everything look more romantic than it really is. Peyton, his bride, wore a sleek cream gown with a train too long for someone that confident. Russell looked sharp in his tailored suit. He stood tall, proud, and when he made his speech, he thanked everyone. His coach, his best friend, his foster coordinator from back in the day. Everyone, except me. I didn't flinch. I clapped with the rest. But inside, something folded in on itself. I had raised him since he was 10. I gave him a bedroom when he came to me with just a plastic bag and a silence that scared even the social worker. I taught him to drive. I taught him how to show up for people. But I guess some lessons don't stick. Later that evening, when they opened the dance floor, someone handed me a flute of champagne. The glass was sweating from the cold, but my hands were dry. I held it without sipping. A younger guest leaned over a girl with Peyton's sharp cheekbones and asked if I was part of the groom's family. I said yes. She tilted her head and said, "Oh, I thought you were with the staff." I didn't correct her. What would have been the point? When they dimmed the lights for the couple's first dance, I sat still in the shadows, watching them sway under that ridiculous heart-shaped arch. Everyone clapped phones up, lights flashing like a Hollywood scene. But no one saw the woman who paid for the entire venue tucked behind a fern. I had paid for it all, of course. Quietly, as always. That had been the pattern, me funding things, them taking credit. I thought this wedding would feel different. I thought maybe, just maybe, there'd be a moment, a nod, a smile, something. But there was nothing. I left before the cake was served. And now, as I sit here thinking back to that night, I realize it was never about the seat at the table. It was about being written out of the story altogether. Have you ever watched someone erase you while smiling at you? That's how it began, and that's why I stayed silent. But silence doesn't mean weakness. Not always. Not this time. They came back from their honeymoon 2 weeks later. Russell didn't call. No check-in, no casual hello, no thank you for the wedding. I found out they were home only because a neighbor mentioned seeing Peyton unloading grocery bags in high heels. That was Peyton. Always polished, always performing. I waited a few days. Then I baked a small tray of lemon bars and drove over. I'd made that recipe for Russell since he was 12. It was the only thing he ever asked for on his birthdays. When I got to their condo, I rang the bell. No answer. I tried again. After a moment, a young woman in a cleaning uniform opened the door, just a crack. She looked confused. I told her I was Russell's mother. She blinked, then said calmly that the couple was resting and they preferred not to be disturbed without notice. She added that I could leave the box if I wanted. I placed the tray in her hands and stepped back. The door shut without a sound. That night, I stayed awake longer than I should have. I didn't cry. I just stared at the ceiling, trying to understand how things had shifted so quickly. 2 months earlier, he called every Sunday, updating me about work. The wedding plans, Peyton's ideas for the guest list. Now silence. The following week, I got a text from Peyton, just one line. Thanks for the lemon bars. Russell loved them. No punctuation, no warmth. Still, I told myself they were newlyweds. Maybe they needed space. Maybe they were adjusting. I've always tried to give people room to grow. A few days later, a courier arrived at my house with a sleek black envelope. Inside was an invitation to a private founders' dinner. I was surprised to see my name printed on it, gold foil and all. The dinner was to be held at a downtown rooftop restaurant I'd never been to. No indication of what it was about. But I recognized Russell's new company logo at the bottom. I arrived early. The view was stunning. High glass panels looked out over the skyline, and soft music played under dim Edison bulbs. I saw their names on a reserved table for 3. Russell and Peyton came in 10 minutes late, dressed to impress. He hugged me quickly. She kissed the air near my cheek. They spoke about their honeymoon in Belize, the wildlife reserve, the transformational energy of seeing the ocean from a private yacht. Then came the pitch. Russell said he wanted to build a line of boutique eco-lodges, a modern legacy, he called it. He said I'd inspired the idea with all the hard work I put into my own small chain of rustic inns. Peyton chimed in, calling me a pioneer in the space. Then came the folder. Pages of projections, brand plans, and at the bottom a spot marked signature. He smiled and said this was how we could finally build something together. I kept my face neutral, but in my chest something settled into place. This wasn't a dinner. It was a transaction dressed as family, and I wasn't being invited in. I was being used, quietly, expertly, like I wouldn't even notice. But I did. I noticed everything. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder still unopened beside me. The same folder Russell had slid across the table the night before, calling it our new chapter. My coffee had gone cold. I hadn't taken a sip. I didn't need to read what was inside. I knew. I had seen those glossy executive packets before. I had created a few myself back in the day. I knew the language they used when they wanted something to sound like a gift, when it was really a request. No more than a request. A quiet demand, disguised in smiles and flattery. I called Arthur that afternoon. He was my attorney for nearly 15 years. I trusted him because he never told me what I wanted to hear. He just told the truth. When I handed him the folder and said it came from Russell and Peyton, he looked at me for a long moment before flipping through it. He didn't need long. After maybe 5 pages, he pushed his glasses higher up his nose and leaned back. The transfer of title was buried deep in the packet under a clause labelled Management Streamlining. If I signed where they marked, I'd be handing over the ownership of 3 out of the 5 inns I still held. Russell had already filed paperwork for a new LLC with himself and Peyton listed as primary owners. My name appeared once under a vague advisory role that had no voting power, no rights, and no access to bank accounts. Arthur kept his voice steady. He said this kind of thing happened more than people liked to admit. Family trusts, asset transfers, always dressed up as legacy planning. I asked him what he would do if it were his mother. He didn't answer. He just closed the folder and said we had work to do. That evening, I walked through one of the older inns I still operated. The paint on the shutters had started to peel. The front path was littered with dry leaves. I bent down and picked up a few myself. I had the maintenance crew scheduled for the weekend, but something about being there, about walking those old wooden floors I once varnished myself, made everything feel clear. That place wasn't just a building. It held the weight of 1,000 decisions. The sleepless nights I spent booking contractors. The nights I drove up alone in the snow to fix a pipe, because hiring a plumber on short notice would cost more than I could afford. It held years, decades. My fingerprints were in every corner. Russell knew that. He had grown up in these halls, running barefoot across those creaky floorboards. He'd helped me fold laundry in the back room during spring break. He'd watched me hold this whole business together with duct tape and grit, and now he wanted to rebrand it, package it, sell it under his name. I stayed until dark, turning off each light one by one. Then I drove back home and sat in my driveway for a long while, hands still on the wheel. I wasn't angry, not exactly, but there was a chill sitting in my chest that wouldn't leave. A quiet awareness that something had shifted in ways I couldn't fix with a conversation or a holiday dinner. I had spent so many years believing that love would create loyalty, that being there for someone would be enough to make them stay good. But I was wrong. Sometimes love doesn't bind, sometimes it blinds. And when the veil finally lifts, it doesn't come with a loud sound. It comes with silence, the kind that follows after a door has closed behind you, and you realize no one is running after you to open it. A week passed before I heard from Russell again. He sent a short message asking if I had reviewed the documents. No greeting, no warmth. Just a sentence that felt more like a reminder than a conversation. I didn't reply. 3 days later, I received a formal email. This time it came from a business account under the name of their new LLC. It included a follow-up packet and a message stating the urgency of streamlining ownership structure for upcoming investor interest. There was no mention of our family, no acknowledgement of what those ins meant to me, just bullet points, numbers, and deadlines. That night I pulled out a box of old photographs. I hadn't looked through them in years. There was one of Russell, maybe 15, standing beside me on the porch of our first inn. His face was soft, younger still unguarded. He was holding a tray of cookies we made for guests that Easter weekend. I remember the way he had smiled when the guests complimented him, the way his chest puffed out just a little. Back then, he wanted to help. He wanted to learn. There was a light in him, a hunger to belong. And I gave him everything I had. I built that sense of home around him. I tried to be the person he could always turn to, the one who would never give up on him. But people change. Or maybe they return to who they were before the world expected kindness from them. The next afternoon, Arthur came by my house with a cup of black coffee and a plan. He had reviewed every line in their documents, flagged every clause that transferred control without compensation. He asked me if I wanted to contest it directly. I told him I didn't want a war. I wanted clarity. So he made a suggestion. We'd create a temporary shell company in my name, quietly transfer my shares from the inns I still owned into that entity, freeze any access to the books unless approved by both me and Arthur. No announcement, no drama, just legal repositioning. I agreed. A week later, Peyton called. Her tone was overly sweet. She said she'd love to get lunch and talk through any hesitations I might be feeling. She said they had big plans and they didn't want me to feel left out. I said I was busy and ended the call. That evening, I visited one of the inns unannounced. I sat in the dining room just as I used to when I lived upstairs. The staff was new, most of them young and efficient, but unsure of who I was. I watched how they moved, how they treated guests. It was professional but cold. Everything was polished, but something was missing. It wasn't about the decor or the amenities, it was the feeling. That sense of being seen, of being remembered. I had built that in every room. It wasn't written into manuals or procedures. It came from presence, from care. Russell and Peyton didn't want legacy. They wanted a brand. They wanted numbers and logos and curated Instagram feeds. And for that, they needed me gone, or at least quiet. But I wasn't going to disappear. Not this time. Not just because someone thought they could outpaper me. I stayed until the last guests finished dessert. I walked the back hallway where we used to keep handwritten guest journals. They were gone now, replaced by QR codes and online surveys. That night, I finally opened my laptop and began drafting something I hadn't touched in years. My story. Not for them, not for court, but for me. Because sometimes the only way to protect what you've built is to remember it out loud. 2 weeks passed without a single word from Russell or Peyton. Not a call, not an email. The silence wasn't passive, it felt deliberate, and for the first time I didn't rush to fill it. Instead, I went back to the basics. I spent my mornings walking the perimeter of my smaller inn, the one up north, near the pine grove. That property had always been my favorite. It was the first I ever owned outright. I remembered painting the shutters myself, hauling gravel for the garden path. The staff there still knew me by name. They poured my coffee without asking, left the window seat open for me. It reminded me that I still had roots, that not everything had been taken. One afternoon, I sat down with Cynthia, the inn manager, who'd been with me for over a decade. She closed the office door and told me she had overheard something strange during a recent call with the supplier. Apparently, Russell had tried to reroute the linen contract under the new company name, claiming ownership of the whole chain. Cynthia hadn't responded, but she had taken notes, detailed ones. I asked her to forward them to Arthur. That night, Arthur called me from his office. He had pulled the registration on the LLC Russell filed. Then he went further. He found Peyton's signature on several other business ventures over the last 5 years. Shell companies, mostly inactive, often dissolved within months. There were patterns, startup investments followed by legal disputes. Civil claims settled quietly, names switched out, histories scrubbed. Arthur didn't say it directly. He didn't have to. Peyton had done this before. Maybe not with family, but certainly with people who trusted her. And now I understood why the tone had shifted so quickly, why Russell had become distant. She had him wrapped in a vision of control disguised as expansion, and he had let her steer. Still, I didn't move in anger. I moved in layers. Arthur and I reviewed all active contracts tied to the inns I still held. We quietly pulled them from Russell's LLC, citing misrepresentation. Arthur handled it with surgical precision. He also began drafting new bylaws for my personal holdings, shielding them under a trust that excluded all non-blood heirs, unless named directly. I didn't add Russell. Instead, I called my accountant and made another change. The quarterly funds I usually allocated for discretionary business development were redirected into a scholarship fund, one I would name after my own mother, a woman who raised 5 children while running a roadside motel with her bare hands. The fund would support older women starting over women who had spent decades giving only to find themselves discarded once they were no longer useful. It felt right. The next morning, as I signed the papers, a calm settled over me. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need a courtroom or a confrontation. I had built something lasting. And now I was protecting it, not just from Russell and Peyton, but from becoming a mirror of the very thing I fought against all my life. Legacy wasn't just what you left behind. It was what you refused to let be stolen. And I had just drawn the line, quietly, completely. It was late September when Russell finally showed up at my door. He didn't call ahead. He never did anymore. He just knocked, holding a brown envelope in one hand and a forced smile on his face. I hadn't seen him in over a month, not since I shifted the properties into the new trust. I opened the door and stepped aside without saying a word. He sat at the kitchen table where I had once taught him how to count change from the tip jar at the inn. Now his posture was tight, his gaze darting around the room like he was looking for something to blame or justify. He placed the envelope on the table and pushed it toward me. It contained a revised proposal. Fewer properties this time, just one inn, the newest one with the highest occupancy rate. He called it a compromise. I listened. I nodded at the appropriate moments, but I didn't touch the envelope. He launched into a speech about timing, branding, generational progress. His words were rehearsed, polished, like he had been coached by someone else. Peyton's cadence echoed in his phrasing, in the way he used terms like scalability and equity positioning. He said this was about honoring my legacy by making it evolve. When he finished, he leaned back and waited. I stood up, walked to the sink, and rinsed out my coffee mug. I didn't answer him. Not right away. He shifted in his seat. His confidence began to fray. And that's when he said something he hadn't said in years. He told me I was being emotional, that business required hard choices, that if I wasn't ready to move forward, maybe I was holding everyone else back. I felt a stillness rise in me. Not anger, not sadness, just clarity. I told him I had already made a decision, that the properties would remain under my control, that I had transferred management authority to a new team I trusted, that no agreement, past or future, would move forward without Arthur's sign-off. I told him calmly, directly, without hesitation. His face hardened. He said this wasn't what he expected from me, that I used to be more generous, more open. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. I said I was still generous, just not blind. He left without finishing his coffee. That night I sat alone in the same spot. The brown envelope was still on the table. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Instead, I wrote a letter, not to Russell, not to Peyton, but to myself. I wrote about the years I spent building something from nothing, about the weight of solitude, about the strength it takes to be soft in a world that rewards sharp edges. I folded that letter and placed it in the back of my journal. I wasn't sure if I would ever read it again, but I needed to write it, because that chapter with Russell was closing, not with a slam, not with a fight, but with a lock turning gently, firmly from my side of the door. There was no room left for negotiation, only boundaries and peace. A few days after Russell's visit, I received a letter from a law office I didn't recognize. It arrived by courier, hand-delivered, no return address. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, sealed with an embossed logo I had never seen before. Inside was a formal notice. Russell and Peyton were filing a petition for arbitration, claiming verbal agreements had been made between us regarding shared ownership and inheritance of business assets. There was no preamble, no phone call, no chance to speak as mother and son, just paperwork. Language carefully selected to sound respectful while making it clear they intended to fight for what they believed they were owed. Arthur came by that evening. He read the notice without surprise. In fact, he had predicted something like this would come, though he had hoped it wouldn't. He calmly explained what it meant, how the process would unfold, and what I could expect if it went to a full hearing. But I wasn't focused on the legal implications. I was still caught on the word they used. Inheritance. That word struck deeper than any court threat could, because it meant they had already decided I was no longer living in their version of the future. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't even a person. I was a stepping stone, a placeholder, someone whose only value came from what she could be turned into once she was no longer standing in the way. I closed my eyes that night and tried to recall the boy who used to fall asleep with his head on my lap during thunderstorms. I tried to find him in the man who now saw me as a barrier to his ambitions. I couldn't. The next morning, I drove to a local non-profit I had been quietly supporting for years. It helped single women over 50 re-enter the workforce, especially those who had been homemakers or caregivers most of their adult lives. I asked the director if we could talk. We sat in her tiny office for over an hour. I told her about my scholarship idea. But more than that, I told her I wanted to contribute in a different way. I wanted to fund a space, a retreat maybe, a place where women like me, those who had spent a lifetime giving, supporting, and being overlooked, could come to rest, plan, and rebuild. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she nodded and smiled. That same afternoon, Arthur filed a formal response to the arbitration notice. It was short, clear. We contested every claim and provided documentation showing that no verbal agreements had been made and that all business transfers had been executed properly through legal channels. But that wasn't the part that mattered most to me. The next day, I sat down at my desk and began writing letters. Not legal ones, personal ones. To my former housekeeper who had stayed with me through lean years. To my first guest at the very first inn. To the widow who wrote to thank me last winter for keeping the fireplace lit after her husband passed. These people remembered me not for what I owned, but for how I showed up. And I needed to remember that too. By the end of the week, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Steady. They could take me to court. They could twist the past into something convenient. But they couldn't change who I had been or what I had built with my own two hands. I wasn't going anywhere, and I wasn't going quietly. Dinner was held at one of the newer inns. Peyton's choice, of course. Everything was curated to impress: pressed linens, tall glasses that caught the candlelight just right, and a menu filled with dishes I could barely pronounce. The guest list was small but strategic. A handful of investors, 2 board members from the Regional Development Council, and a local journalist who had recently written a piece praising the rising power couples of hospitality. I knew why I was invited. It wasn't out of love. It wasn't out of reconciliation. I was there to be paraded, the matriarch, the face of the brand. A silent figurehead who would smile for photos and keep her mouth shut. I arrived early, wearing the same brooch I used to pin on when meeting bankers in the early days. It was shaped like a rose, slightly chipped at the edges. My late husband gave it to me after we made our first mortgage payment. No one at the table would know that. But I did. Russell greeted me with a stiff hug. His suit was too tight at the shoulders, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. Peyton hovered behind him, holding a clipboard and whispering last-minute notes to a server. As the evening unfolded, I played my part. I nodded when introduced. I answered politely when asked how I started in hospitality. I let them mention family legacy and seamless generational transition without interrupting. I let the myths roll out like a red carpet. But I was watching, listening. The investors were being courted to support a new luxury expansion, one that involved converting the last 2 original properties into event centers. The inn, where Russell learned to make coffee for guests at age 12, would be gutted. The garden I planted myself, dug with my own hands, would be turned into parking. After dessert, Russell raised his glass and gave a toast. He thanked everyone for their belief, for their partnership. Then he turned toward me. He spoke of my sacrifices, of how I had built the foundation, of how proud he was to carry the torch forward. Everyone clapped. Then he announced something unexpected. That starting next quarter, I would be stepping back entirely from operations. That I would move into a new role as emeritus founder. Symbolic, gracious, out of the way. I stood, calmly, quietly. I thanked everyone for coming, for supporting the vision of what we built. I said I was proud of what the inns had become, but I also said I needed to clarify something. I hadn't agreed to any transition. I had not stepped back. And I was not handing over control of the remaining properties. In fact, I said those inns were no longer under the same umbrella as the rest of the business. I had transferred them to a foundation, one created to support women rebuilding their lives after long years of sacrifice. The room went still. I thanked them again and sat back down. Russell's face lost all colour. Peyton's hand gripped the stem of her wineglass so tight I thought it might snap. No one applauded. I finished my coffee in silence, left the brooch on the table, and walked out. Not because I was angry, but because the performance was over, and I didn't owe them another scene. 2 days after the dinner, Russell showed up at my house again. This time he didn't knock. He stood outside the gate, pacing. I saw him through the kitchen window while steeping a pot of tea. He looked like a boy again, a tired, angry boy who couldn't understand why the world wasn't bending in his favor. I didn't invite him in. I stepped outside instead. He began speaking before I reached the gate, said I had blindsided him, said the investors were furious. Peyton hadn't spoken to him since that night. He accused me of ruining everything he had spent the last 2 years building. He said I embarrassed him. I let him speak. I watched the frustration unravel into something thinner, something closer to fear. When he finally ran out of breath, I told him the truth. The inns were never built for investors. They were built for people, travelers, strangers who needed a place to feel human again. And somewhere along the way, he forgot that. He turned my life's work into a pitch deck, and I wouldn't let that legacy be gutted just so he could feel important. He didn't respond. His silence said enough. That afternoon, Arthur came by with the first press draft. The foundation would go public next week. We were hosting a quiet event at the Northern Inn, announcing the Women's Grant Program and the new retreat centre. It wouldn't be flashy, just a warm space filled with those who believed in the kind of work that didn't need a spotlight. I asked Arthur if we should expect legal pushback. He nodded, said Russell had already retained separate counsel, said Peyton had likely coordinated most of it. But he didn't seem worried. Everything was airtight. And more importantly, we were ready. The next few days passed in a blur. There were meetings with the foundation board, phone calls, with the retreat staff, updates from Cynthia about staff training. I felt useful again. Not as a figurehead, but as a woman who still had work left to do. I didn't hear from Russell until the day before the foundation event. A letter arrived, not typed, not on legal stationery, just a plain white envelope with my name in his handwriting. Inside was a single sheet. He wrote that he didn't understand me anymore, that he tried to follow the blueprint I had given him, but he had never felt like he truly belonged. That building, something next to me, had always felt like standing in my shadow, and Peyton made him feel like he could finally step into the light. He didn't apologize, but he didn't threaten anything either. He just said he was stepping back. The last line read, "I thought I was ready to carry your name, but maybe it was never really mine to carry." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. Instead, I stepped into the hallway, walked past the old guest photos, past the shelves lined with ledgers and hand-bound journals. I touched the wall as I passed, the same wall where I used to hang thank you notes from guests, the same wall Russell had helped paint that summer he first moved in. I paused there for a moment, then I kept walking. Because some endings don't need closing lines. They just need to be walked past, quietly, completely. The morning of the foundation event arrived with a crispness in the air that reminded me of the early days at the first inn. The sky was a deep blue, cloudless, and the pine trees lining the drive stood tall and still as if holding their breath. Guests began arriving just before noon. Some were longtime friends. Others were strangers, Chabissaus, who had written letters over the years. There were women who had raised children alone, women who had escaped things they never talked about, women with lined faces and tired eyes who still stood tall. I recognized something in all of them, not just resilience, but clarity, a quiet knowing that came from having been dismissed and having survived. We gathered in the great room of the Northern Inn. The fireplace was lit. The tables were modest, decorated with sprigs of rosemary and small framed photographs from the early days of the business. Not staged photos, but real moments. A guest laughing in the hallway, a child playing with a suitcase, a dog curled up by the back door during a storm. I stepped up to the front without fanfare. I wasn't there to deliver a speech. I was there to witness something begin. I spoke briefly. I told them how the inns were never meant to be about profit. They were built from memory, from struggle, from the quiet belief that kindness had value. And I said that the foundation wasn't a gift, but a continuation, a thread carried forward by women who had lived long enough to understand that legacy is not what we leave behind, but what we live with. There was no applause when I finished, just silence, heavy, sacred. After the gathering, I walked the property with two of the new directors. We talked about how the cottages would be repurposed, which buildings needed repair, what kind of programming would best support the women we hoped to serve. There was so much to do, but none of it felt overwhelming. It felt like coming home. Later that evening, I sat alone on the back porch. The wind had picked up. The sky was beginning to dim. I held a mug of tea in my hands and watched the lights come on one by one in the windows of the main house. Russell never came. I didn't expect him to, but I thought of him. I thought of the boy he had been, the way he used to run down the hallway barefoot, always in a rush, always laughing. And I thought of the man who had stood outside my gate, so angry, so lost. I didn't hate him. I didn't feel sorry for him either. I just let the memory sit beside me for a while, like an old photograph you no longer frame but still keep in a drawer. Faded, but not forgotten. Then I stood up. The porch creaked beneath my feet. I stepped back inside and closed the door gently behind me. There was still work to be done, and I was not finished yet. Spring arrived without making a fuss. The snow melted in soft patches. The earth soaked up the thaw, and the garden near the back porch began to stir on its own. No one planted anything yet, but still something green pushed through. I found myself waking earlier, walking longer. I began spending mornings in the small cottage at the edge of the retreat property. It had once been a storage unit. Now it held rows of books, quiet chairs, and a kettle that never stayed cold for long. Some of the women called it the listening room. It wasn't part of the programming. But somehow that space became the heart of it all. Every so often a woman would sit across from me and speak, not always with words, sometimes just with silence, eyes, full hands trembling slightly as they held their mugs. They didn't need advice. They just needed not to be alone in their remembering. One day I ran into Cynthia near the kitchen. She told me someone had called the office, asking whether the founder would be willing to speak at a university panel. Something about women in legacy leadership. I smiled and told her to pass. I wasn't interested in panels. I was interested in planting. That afternoon, I knelt in the dirt and planted lavender. My knees ached, my palms pressed deep into the earth, but it didn't matter. I wasn't building anything for approval anymore. I was grounding myself, making something grow that didn't ask for applause. The final piece of paperwork came a week later. Russell had signed it. A formal withdrawal from the arbitration process. No letter this time, just the signature. A clean ending. I sat with the envelope in my lap for a long time. Then I placed it in a drawer next to the one with his first letter. Not out of bitterness, but because stories, even painful ones, deserve to be kept. Not to relive, but to remember. That evening I watched the sun dip behind the hills. The porch was quiet. The windows glowed from inside the main house. Laughter drifted across the breeze. The kind of laughter that didn't demand anything. It just filled the air. I leaned back in the chair, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and closed my eyes. Not everything had been healed, but something had shifted, and maybe that was enough. If this story reminded you of a moment when you were quietly erased or found the strength to reclaim your voice, you're not alone. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is choose peace over recognition, dignity over noise. If you've lived through something like this or seen someone who has, I hope you'll take a moment to share or reflect. Stories like these aren't just fiction. For many, they are the truth we carry. Thank you for listening.